Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, right now, from time to time on the News Hour, we cut through the breaking news to examine one particular story and analyse what's at stake. In essence, taking a closer look at why it matters. Well, tonight, media scrutiny. At an event in Edinburgh yesterday evening, the head of news and current affairs at Channel 4 called Prime Minister Boris Johnson a known liar and said broadcasters must call out politicians when they're not being truthful. Let's take a listen to what she said.
What do we do when a known liar becomes our Prime Minister? I've talked to journalists from several news organisations about this issue. They said they would be loath to use that word, liar. Is it time for us to start using the L word? I believe that we need to start calling politicians out as liars when they lie. If we continue to be so polite, how will our viewers know that politicians are lying?
Well, Dorothy Byrne stood firmly by those comments when she spoke to Sky News a little bit earlier this afternoon.
That L word isn't a word that I would bandy about. But I think when we are divided, the one thing that we must unite on is the central importance of truth. You know, in the US, it has started to be that a number of political figures have said that each person's truth is just a matter of their own opinion. There is no such thing as truth. And if you think something's true, then it's true. And what I'm saying is we mustn't go down that road. And so this is, I suppose, in many ways, a warning to politicians that you've got to tell the truth. And if you don't, we will call you out. So keep your own house in order. It's not about me being against any individual politician. I have huge respect for politicians. I think it's remarkable that people go into public life and undergo such unpleasantness as happens in political life now. So I'm not against politicians, I'm for truth.
So, what does the Prime Minister think about all of this? Well, we've had this response from a number 10 source. It's disappointing to see the head of a supposedly impartial news organisation decide to use deliberately inflammatory language to make a strong political statement. We will now consider our response. But how does using such strong language fit with a journalist's responsibility to be impartial? Well, since the inauguration of Donald Trump, broadcasters in the US have had difficulty calling out the president's lies while trying to remain balanced. One man who knows the challenges that they face is Angelo Carusone, president of Media Matters. They're a US media watchdog dedicated to correcting misinformation, and we can speak to him now. Thanks very much for being with us on Sky News. So what was your reaction when you heard those comments from the head of news at a British broadcaster that it's time that British journalists started using the L word, liar?
I think it's an interesting, I thought it was the right conversation to have, and the proactivity of it is really important because, you know, there's a difference between just pointing out when a politician or an individual says something that is not factually accurate to when you characterize them as a liar, because calling them a liar is an expression of the person's, you know, to their overall trustworthiness, right? It's beyond just one individual claim, and it also speaks to intent, that there's an intention behind that incorrect statement in order to misinform people. And that the power of that word was even validated by the Prime Minister's office, right? When they responded saying and even acknowledging that it is an inflammatory descriptor because it does have such power that transcends partisan ideology. So I think it's an important conversation to have proactively. You know, in the States, news media did not really have a proactive approach to Donald Trump when he took office. And so they never really adapted their policies and procedures around dealing with flat out misinformation. And as a result of it, for the majority of his administration so far, they've actually become megaphones and amplifiers for his lies because they just haven't adapted fast enough.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very emotive word, isn't it? Liar, as you say. And I guess in the UK, which is pretty divided at the moment over Brexit, in the US, which is also divided over Donald Trump, using emotive language can actually widen that gap, can't it?
Indeed, and I think that I would come at this from a few perspectives. To get to the point of calling somebody a liar is probably the very end of that spectrum. And there are going to be some outlets that once there's a preponderance of evidence feel like that is an appropriate descriptor and characterization for that individual. I don't know if that's totally necessary though, but I do think that, but I still think it's an important conversation to have. And here's a perfect example. In the States. One of the things that headline writers, is guidelines that have guided newsrooms for decades, is that when the president of the United States says something, you traditionally, as a matter of tradition, quote the president in the headlines. And that's never really been a problem, except when the president is somebody like Donald Trump, who's said 12,000 demonstrable falsehoods since he's been in office. What we found in our research is that on average, the major news outlets combined amplify a direct, demonstrable falsehood from Donald Trump 19 times a day in their headlines. And that's a huge problem in terms of their journalistic responsibility, because 70% of Americans only read the headline. And so that means that all they're really getting is a reinforcement of misinformation. And so what never happened, and that's why I think it gets back to this question of whether or not it's appropriate to call someone a liar, is even if people say, look, it's not appropriate to call somebody a liar, what will come out of this, though, is a conversation about how their own policies deal with somebody who's a chronic misinformer. And if that's all that comes out of this, it's a net win for the UK.
Yeah, it's a very worrying statistic you've just given us. I suppose part of the problem is that Donald Trump is someone who doesn't use the language normally associated with someone of that office. So he's using unpolitical language, if you like. Is there then a danger that journalists try and match that, do the same, and therefore we don't trust journalists as much as perhaps we used to?
Yeah, I think that's right. I am sensitive to the idea that if they start to, get into what appears to be the arena itself, that they actually become or it could be perceived as being just another political player, and that could actually hurt their mission. So I am sensitive to that. I think it's important for journalists, at least amongst themselves, to acknowledge whether somebody is a liar or a chronic misinformer, because that should shape the way that they interact with and deal with that individual. They shouldn't get the benefit of the doubt. They shouldn't have their misinformation amplified in headlines. There is a value in consistently pointing out that something is not true when it is demonstrably not true. Because to your point earlier, one of the things that has happened as a result of that not taking place early enough in the States is that, and instead a lot of the newsrooms just fighting back in terms of the inflammatory language, but ignoring the underlying misinformation, is that now it is increasingly acknowledged that people can make up their own truth, and that facts matter less and less. And when you don't operate from the same fact base, that's when the institutions of a democracy start to erode and become further undermined. It's one thing to have acrimony when people really disagree, but at least see things the same way, but just disagree about how to deal with it. It's an entirely different thing when they're operating from two entirely different fact sets. And that's the real balance. And I think the first priority of journalism is to make sure that they are always champions for truth and facts. And not to themselves be, a champion for, say, a resistance or a champion against one political figure simply because they lack decorum.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point you make. And just before you go, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. Here in the UK, British news on television and radio has to be impartial by law. Of course, that's not the case in the United States. Which system do you think is best?
I think that it is best to have a system in which you have a robust public media. I mean, part of the reason it has to be impartial is because of the robustness of the public media. And as a result of that, you get a lot of editorial priorities that are shaped not by advertisers or by commercial interest, but by public interest. And so I think we would greatly benefit from some improved impartiality rules. A lot of our underlying systems started to erode when we got rid of the very basic regulations that we had on talk radio and the rules to give both partisan sides, both sides. You know, we don't have to give equal opportunity to ideas, although in the States that actually tends to happen consistently. They will advantage climate science misinformation just about the same amount that they give actual climate scientist coverage. The same thing happens on economics. So sometimes that policy tends to disadvantage, you know, fringe ideas or ridiculous stuff. But when it comes to promoting partisan players or politicians, I think having some impartiality rules and some fairness and making sure that there's equal time is an important part of it, because that allows for different sides to argue about what the facts actually mean, and it lets journalists and newsrooms focus on the facts. And if you start to erode that, then it means that journalists themselves have to become interpreters of facts as well. And that's when you start to get to your point earlier,
Angelo,
where
Carrison, sorry, we're out of time. Many thanks indeed.